This lecture we're going to look at cognitive theories of prejudice. It's also an intra-individual level of explanation. It's alongside the personality explanations we considered previously, the authoritarian personality, also intrapersonal dynamics. But over here we're not looking so much at the motivational aspects as in authoritarianism. We're looking at the cognitive aspects, the thinking aspects, brain processes, cognitive processes that are associated with prejudice. So let's start off by looking at some popular, and you might have seen them before, sort of cognitive illusions, distortions, perceptual distortions. Like in this picture over here, it looks like snakes moving. As you cast your eyes across that picture, you'll see movement. Of course, it's a stationary picture. The movement that you see is just a consequence of the functioning of the cognitive system. And likewise over here, look at the dots in the middle of those figures. It looks like the one on the right is bigger than the one on the left. In actual fact, they are exactly the same size. The circle on the left is the same as the one on the right. It's just that the context around, the big dots, the big circles around make the one look small, whereas the small circles around the other make the other look, on the right, look large. So the things that we see in the world aren't necessarily what's in the world, and that's the important point over here. The things that we see are a consequence partly of the objects that are in the world, but also partly a consequence of the operations of the cognitive system. So our perceptions can be distorted. This is a lovely one over here. All those lines are parallel, but they don't look parallel. It looks like it bulges almost in the center of that picture, and that is also just an optical illusion. Once again, the lesson over here is there can be a discrepancy between the impression we receive, what we see, and what exists. And this is my favorite of all. Can you count the black dots? As your eye moves towards that black dot, so the black dot moves away. Another optical illusion. So what is the focus of the cognitive approach? Well, the cognitive approach in psychology is interested in studying brain structures. So there's a biological element to it. Brain functioning underlies our perceptions, our feelings, our affect, and our cognition, our thoughts. The cognitive process, and we're going to make a distinction between these biological and the cognitive processes that underlie perception. So there what we'll be looking at is cognitive processes, this comparison between the big dots, big circles around, the small one in. Those are cognitive processes. And then we're interested in causes and effects, like we generally are interested in social psychology. The environment, the biological, environmental, and affective factors shape our thinking. So our history, the way where we grew up, our mood at the moment affects these processes. And of course, these processes then affect the mental processes, behavioral and interpersonal effects of mental processes. It affects how we view people. It affects how we view not only are lines parallel, but are those people like me? Are those people, can I recognize their faces? How prejudice and stereotyping, we're going to link these fundamental cognitive processes to prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination. So we're going to start with the brain structure and function. I'm not going to spend much time on that. But there's a lot of work with, and I've got a nice review paper there if you're interested, in fMRI scanning. We're basically looking at what parts of the brain become active in doing certain tasks. And so what they do in these kinds of experiments is they show, for example, white subjects, which are American undergrad students, they show them pictures of black and white subjects, photographs of people, black people and white people, and then they look at, well, what parts of the brain function in the processing differentially of pictures of white people and pictures of black people, pictures of males, pictures of females, etc. And you'll see the bottom over here, there's some very interesting correlations essentially between the implicit association test. So in other words, the underlying biases and prejudices that these participants have and which parts of their brains are operating in the recognition of black faces. And so we can see a clear link between prejudices and brain function. And by these kinds of methods, psychologists have identified a number of different biological systems, brain systems, that are implicated in prejudice. So we don't have to go into all the details over here, but if you just took a look at the amygdala, that's sort of brain stem, and that's what we saw lighting up on the previous slide over there. Early threat reward processing. So there's a lot of evidence that in confronting an out-group member, part of the brain system that becomes operational is a startle response, threat rewarding, and these brainstem functions are very difficult to control. They're deep underlying systems. But of course, here if you look at the cortex, the prefrontal cortex over here is also implicated, and this has got to do with empathizing, mentalizing. When you see a picture of a kid from an out-group member starving, for example, a refugee on the TV, your heart goes out to them. You imagine, what is it like? Imagine if I was in that situation. That over there is the much more higher order cognitive processing. So all these cognitive systems, many of these brain systems, I should say, are involved in the processing of information about in-group and out-group. So what is the difference then between a brain structure, the structure that we've looked at there, and a cognitive structure? Well, the cognitive structure deals with concepts. The concept of a spoon. So if you take a look at those objects over there in the photograph, so it's clearly the first one is a spoon, the second one is a spoon, the third one's a spoon, the fourth one is a knife. But what is the next one? I don't know if you've ever eaten Chinese takeaway, for example, with an object like that. It's a fork and a spoon together. So it defies the category. So these objects that we see over here are human categories. So the category that we apply, a knife versus a fork versus a spoon versus whatever that other thing is, that sort of defies the categorization. So the interesting thing is that these are cultural phenomena, and we observe the world in cultural phenomena terms. So we see spoons, we see forks, we see knives. These categories become endemic to how we view the world. We see chairs, we see tables. These are all cultural phenomena. These are categories. They become objects of our perception. We see oranges, apples, pears, different kinds of fruit. We know how to distinguish them, and we see them as those objects. So to illustrate what I mean by you seeing it as an object, this is an illustration used by the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. So what do you see? So at first you might think, okay, that's a duck looking in that direction. You see there, you can see its beak pointing over there, back, quack, quack, quack. It's eye. Or else you might see it's a rabbit looking in that direction, and that what was previously a beak is actually the rabbit's ears. And there's the rabbit's eye and its mouth down there. And you might be able to even say to yourself, oh, I see it now as a rabbit, now I see it as a duck. Now I see it as a rabbit, now I see it as a duck. So you can switch between how you want to see these things. And that actually shows us something fundamental about the cognitive processes, that we see the world as, we see it in terms of categories. We see it in terms of the idea of a duck, or the idea, we recognize these things. And so there's culture has a role to play in what we see, culture. So there we are, the cognitive processes, these categories that come out of our culture that now shape the things that we see or we don't see in the world. So if I had to ask you who's that person in the center there? Now, when I've done this lecture live and asked the students, invariably they say it's Christ or Jesus. And you'd wonder, how come it's possible to recognize a few little scribbles over there as a particular historical character? Well, once again, it's culture. Culture tells us what to see. And of course, this is a sketch by Rembrandt, and it is called Christ at the Gates. And it's amazing how over hundreds of years and across continents, individuals still see that as Christ. And if we went to certain other societies, we would find that they wouldn't recognize that as Christ, of course. It requires a certain ideological context, this perception. So there's a little bit of a contrast between brain systems that are involved in perception, the fundamental biological substrate that makes it possible to perceive, that makes it possible to respond, how we respond to outgroup others, and then of course the cognitive system, which are cultural categories, ways of seeing, ideological ideas that then come and shape the way we see. The basic point that both of these systems that we're talking about, how they affect us, is that we don't necessarily see what's out there, but there's a process of interpretation that gives meaning to the stimulus that comes into the eyes, and that's really what we're looking at over here in the cognitive approach. There's a form of almost perceptual illusion involved in this kind of perception. Now the question is this implicated in prejudice? Is this implicated in racism, sexism, homophobia, etc.? Notice this profound statement by Hamilton and Gifford. Differential perceptions of groups can develop simply as a consequence of normal cognitive processes. Imagine that. This is basically a cognitive approach, it says over here. Just the normal processes, the normal cognitive processes that produce prejudice. Just the same as when we look at those perceptual illusions, we see movement over there. It's a normal cognitive process. Likewise, what they're saying over here, prejudice for outgroups, discrimination, hatred, etc., develops from just those normal cognitive. It's an illusion, folks. It's a normal cognitive process that produces these prejudicial perceptions. And the three processes that we're going to discuss in the lecture today. There's categorization, there's the accentuation effect, and then there is what we're going to call the illusory correlation. So let's start off with the first, categorization. What is it? Simply the classification of objects into different groups. The ability to detect similarities and differences between apples, oranges, pears, cats, dogs, etc. in different categories of life. Now, if a Martian came down to Earth, do you think they would recognize the difference between a small dog and a cat? It's unlikely. They've got 4 legs, they're furry, they've got a tail, etc. They look very similar, but we would never make that mistake. We easily make those categorical distinctions. Why? It's because categorization and this recognition of difference is argued to be a universal cognitive process. All humans do it. We do it all the time. It's hardwired in. It's necessary for survival. And of course, in the social context, how categorization works is, well, we take the same cognitive process and now we apply it to people. We classify people into groups as just a natural way in which we perceive the world around us through categorizing similarities and differences. And so Henri Tartfel argues that stereotypes arise from the process of categorization. There we are. Where does prejudicial stereotypes come from? Well, they arise from this process of categorization. So the categorization introduces simplicity and order where there's complexity and nearly random variation. You know, imagine walking down the street and you see a car and every car is absolutely unique. And whoa, look at this car. You know, and wow, look at this car. You wouldn't get 10 paces because you'd be just fascinated by the uniqueness of each car that you see. But no, we don't. We don't even look at the cars. We've classified them as cars. We know things about them as cars, and we just carry on with our business. And basically what Taj was arguing, the same things happen with people. We classify people into different groups. We know what they are. We can carry on with our business. A very important effect of categorization is the accentuation effect, the effect of categorization. So categorization treats everyone the same. They're all in this category. The accentuation effects accounts for almost an illusion where we accentuate the differences between categories. And this is a fantastic little experiment done in a Scandinavian country that illustrates it. You'll notice there's a complex definition of the accentuation effect. Perceptual distortion of accentuated differences between stimuli that differ on two correlated dimensions, a focal and peripheral. Okay, so here we are. Here's our two correlated dimensions. Our focal dimension, the thing we're looking for, is height. And the peripheral dimension, you see the S and the N below these people. These are smokers and non-smokers. So are height and smoking behavior correlated? No. So there's no correlation between them. So in this experiment, the subjects are shown an airport lounge in Scandinavia. And there are different people of different heights, and some are smoking and some are not smoking. And then they ask the subjects to reproduce afterwards. They take the picture away. Can you draw the people? And it's pretty accurate, the drawing. In the second version of the experiment, they take tourists, and Scandinavians are Scandinavian business people. That's the B, the business people. Scandinavians are generally tall, and they're taller than tourists. So now is a correlation between the focal dimension, height, and the peripheral dimension with their local tourists, with their foreign tourists or business people, locals. And you'll see afterwards they reproduce the picture of the people in the airport lounge. There's an accentuation, you see, of the differences. Those within the group are more similar, and those differences between the groups are larger. In the third version of the experiment, there's a stereotype that Japanese are short. And so, yeah, we've got Japanese tourists over here, and here we have Scandinavians. And of course, the Japanese were of different height and the Scandinavians were of different height, but there's now a very strong correlation between the focal dimension, that is height, and this peripheral dimension. And then they reproduced the picture like that. You know, very tall Scandinavians and very short Japanese. It shows very nicely the accentuation effect. And there's many experiments that have shown this accentuation effect. It reduces, it's a perceptual distortion where the within category differences are reduced and the between category differences are increased. And that's really what the accentuation effect is. And the accentuation effect works in face perception, for example. So if I had to ask you as South African students, where are these people from? And you would say, ooh, okay, China or Asia. It's very difficult for us to make those distinctions. But of course, if you lived in Japan or Korea or China, you might very easily be able to recognize regional differences in looks, as we can here in South Africa. So we can often recognize people that come from Malawi or from the Congo by looking at them. There are subtle differences that if you live in a society you're trained to see. But of course, from outsiders, we just categorize them all as Asians or Chinese, and then they all start looking the same. And so that there's a very good example of the accentuation effect, how it affects face perception. When we categorize people as a group, we tend to minimize the differences between them. They all look the same. There's a way in which this cognitive process affects prejudice. Our final system we're going to look at here is called the illusory correlation. It's the tendency to perceive a relationship between variables where none exists. And the reason why this correlation emerges is because when we've got two events that are low frequency, but we see them happening together, they become attention grabbing. And then we think that those two things go together. So that there's the explanation of why it happens. And here is an example. We don't often hear from South Africa meet Koreans. But if you say, for example, you went to a party and you met a Korean, and you met a Korean with glasses, and you met a Korean with a nice big red headband, which Korean do you think is going to affect your stereotypes, your view of Koreans the most? And this is basically how the illusory correlation works. You take two low frequency events, and when they occur together, they have a very strong effect on our perceptions and our beliefs. So, is wearing glasses low or high frequency? Well, it's reasonably high frequency. It's commonplace. People wear glasses. Okay. Is wearing a red headband low or high frequency? Well, we hardly ever meet people with red headbands. Is meeting Koreans a high or low frequency? It's low frequency. So the question, the issue of illusory correlation, when we meet a Korean and the Korean's wearing a red headband, we think like, whoa, they dress like that. There's maybe like sort of aggression with, flagged by the red headband, or maybe it is martial arts or something like that. So we start making this distinctive perception starts affecting our stereotypes of Koreans. And so how this applies now to the illusory correlation and to prejudice generally, undesirable traits are low frequency traits. People don't do things like picking their nose in public. It's undesirable. Associating with members of outgroups is low frequency. So if we meet an outgroup member who's evidencing an undesirable trait, we tend to associate, now these two low frequency events, we tend to associate undesirable traits with outsiders. Take for example, do you often meet people with Down syndrome? Seldom. It's a low frequency event. Do you often see people picking their nose? Low frequency event. If you went to a party and you saw a person with Down syndrome, they're picking their nose, you're going to start thinking, whoa, people with Down syndrome pick their nose. These two things go together, these two low frequency events, and this helps to explain, this illusory correlation can help to explain why we have negative attitudes towards outsiders. So going back now to the cognitive explanation of prejudice, you remember we start with those optical illusions, and we were basically arguing that the impression we get of the world isn't what's actually in the world. A distortion can happen in how we perceive, and this is essentially what this cognitive approach says. As Hamilton and Gifford said, the differential perceptions of groups can arise simply as a consequence of normal cognitive processes. Our normal cognitive processes make groups look different from what they are, and the three processes that we've looked at over here is categorization. We put people into groups, and then there's this accentuation effect, so the similarities between the individuals in the groups is reduced, and the differences between the groups are increased. A perceptual distortion that is a consequence of normal cognitive processes. And of course the illusory correlation then can explain why we have negative views towards outgroups. We don't meet outgroups very often, and if we do meet outgroups and we see a correlation with a low frequency behavior, we begin to start thinking that they are all like that. The critique of the cognitive approach we're going to continue in subsequent lectures. It naturalizes and individualizes racism. It says, well, racism there's nothing we can do about it. It's just like how our brain works. And of course, there's the ethical problems that provide excuse for racist excesses. It ignores social context. It ignores these broader ideological processes that we discussed, these other levels of analysis. And it also ignores a very important factor of humans. We can choose to act. We don't have to just act according to these perceptual distortions. We can choose to act in other ways.